I'm delighted to say that we're here to discuss Chris Chaplin's new book. Congratulations, Chris. Salafism in the State, Islamic Activism and National Identity in Contemporary Indonesia. It's a highly readable blend of ethnography and deep research, and it really describes the Salafi revivalism in Indonesia with a focus on Yogyakarta. Chris brings to life the Salafi activists, their rivalry with the largest Muslim organization, Nahdlatul Ulama, and how the Salafi movement has been pushing Muslim majoritarianism as a legitimate form of politics and identity in modern Indonesia. I think it's a highly important book and I recommend it. And we're putting a 20% discount info in the chat, so take a look and get it if you haven't read it yet. And we are extremely lucky to have Chris in conversation with none other than Greg Fealy, a leading scholar on Indonesian politics and history specializing in Islam, a longtime professor at ANU, the Australian National University, and a mentor to many of the best scholars on Indonesia. He's written about just about everything to do with Islam and party politics and PKS and even jihadists. Greg has also been analyzing the democratic decline in Indonesia, especially the repression of Salafi activists and other Islamists under the current government of Joko Widodo. So Chris and Greg have a lot to talk about, so I want to get right to it. And then we will open up to questions. We're going to be using the Q&A chat, not the raise hand. So please put any questions in the Q&A and we'll get to them. So with no further ado, I turn it over to Chris and Greg, and thank you both very much. Oh, and I forgot to say, Chris is a research fellow at the London School of Economics. Sorry. Okay, over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Margaret. And it's lovely to have this opportunity to be in conversation with Chris. And I echo all of Margaret's praise for Chris's book on Salafism and the state. And let me raise a copy. It really is, I think, one of the finest works written on contemporary Indonesian Islam, and certainly the best account that we have of Salafism in Indonesia, and indeed very insightful on Salafism more broadly in the Muslim world. So you've done us a great service. So thank you very much, Chris. I wonder if we might start the conversation. In the title for this discussion is the words conservative turn. And this is such a common expression that we hear in recent discussions of Indonesian Islam. And of course, it is Salafism, this very conservative variant of Islam, that's one of the things most often mentioned when people talk about this conservative turn. So just before we discuss your research on Salafism, Chris, I wonder if we might talk a little bit about how scholars and observers have tended to portray Indonesian Islam, but in perhaps 30, 40 years ago, certainly before Indonesia's democratization in the late 1990s, because it seems to me there has been this marked change in attitude, and that's what the popularity of this term, conservative turn, captures. So I wonder what your thoughts were on this.
For sure. And one of the reasons the word conservative turn is so capturing is because we kind of juxtapose it to what happened previously, or what was presumed to happen previously. So yeah, prior to, I suppose, the Reformasi in the 21st century, a lot of the literature out there talking about Islam in Indonesia saw it as fairly benign, fairly apolitical, fairly pluralistic. I believe the term smiling Islam has been used to describe it as well. And because of this, I suppose it did seem quite shocking when the Reformasi happened and you suddenly saw groups such as the Salafis with Laskar Jihad taking to the streets and becoming more vocal. And I suppose it's those two images against each other which has really kind of brought this kind of idea of conservatism kind of into the kind of public fora in Indonesia itself. And really that's kind of progressed, hasn't it, in the 20 years of democracy, from what was initially kind of street politics to the APEC, which was perhaps around the gubernatorial elections in Jakarta in 2017. But I suppose if we go back to that earlier scholarship, what was kind of the beat that was missed was really that there were these kind of underlying kind of issues and kind of tensions and this kind of doctrinal debates, incredibly rich doctrinal debates kind of actually occurring. Salafism itself came to Indonesia in the 1980s, as did lots of other groups, such as the Thoughts of the Ikhwanul Muslim, Hizbut Tahrir as well. And you really saw it kind of emerging underground within university kind of circles. So it's been there for quite a while, and the debates around religion as well and the role it plays in society was always there. But perhaps we've just become a bit more aware of it in the democratic kind of sphere, and especially with kind of current social media and the ability to gain information too. So I suppose my book kind of really tries to talk to that kind of aspect.
And I wonder too that there's a kind of normative element, I think, in a lot of that earlier writing about Indonesian Islam. And I remember there's a scholar in the 1960s that wrote approvingly of Indonesian Islam because he said it had basically the tropical damp had taken away the dryness of the deserts of the Middle East or something like that. So you got this sense that Middle Eastern form of Islam had been turned into a much more acceptable, more friendly form, inclusive form in Indonesia. And this is one of the things that people admired. If we think of the writings of Andrew Beatty, for example, I think who detected, among other scholars, detected some of this change in attitudes within the Muslim community or desire for a more literal form of Islam or more Middle Eastern inspired form of Islam. But a real sense of loss that somehow the Indonesian Islam that he and other people felt was an example for the rest of the Muslim world to follow was, in actual fact, becoming a bit more like the rest of the Muslim world. I mean, we can discuss whether that was really the case, but that was the kind of undertone, I think, in some of that writing. So I wonder if we can turn to your research on Salafism, Chris, and the question of why this movement, and indeed you've spoken a lot in the book about how complex this is and how it's difficult to talk about it as a unified or with a sole identity. I mean, there are a lot of variations within this movement, but why has it grown and what has it meant for Indonesian Muslims to become Salafi, as opposed to becoming, when people are making these choices, as opposed to becoming something else, because there are a great many choices in Indonesia. You could become a traditionalist and join someone like Nahdlatul Ulama or Nahdlatul Wathon, could become a modernist and join Muhammadiyah, but people have made a very precise choice to become Salafi. So can you talk to us about that?
For sure. And I suppose that's one of the driving questions that kind of really kind of inspired me to really look into this, because if we wind it back to, I suppose, when I was in Indonesia in the kind of early Reformasi Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono presidency area, we saw kind of a very vibrant debate within Muslim circles and Islamic circles on what kind of Islam meant in everyday life and where authority came from. The new TV channels were emerging. There was kind of new street politics as well. There was new kind of businesses, those book fairs. But the one thing that was very kind of interesting at the time too, and if we take in that global dynamics of the war on terror and this kind of media obsession with more transnational groups, was that they were emerging in Indonesia at the same time. I mean, Hizbut Tahrir, up until quite recently, until it was banned, was the largest. Indonesia was its largest chapter. And similarly with Salafis, you saw them kind of taking to the streets with Laskar Jihad in the early 2000s. But you also saw this kind of like this backlash. They were seen as controversial, not only in the kind of Western media, but also with groups like Nahdlatul Ulama, who saw them as kind of criticizing their own Islamic traditions. But what kind of inspired me really was like, despite this controversy that we could see in the media, you could see in these kind of like these top level kind of meetings, they were still growing at that grassroots level. So what I really wanted to kind of understand was like, why were they growing? Like, who was joining them? Why were they joining them? And what was attracting people to these kind of movements? And that's where you kind of really got this kind of sense of how Salafism actually thrives, and that is at its local level. I mean, it does purport to be universalist. I mean, it's also derided for being somewhat connected to Saudi Arabia. But when you look at activists on the ground, they're very versatile and very approachable. And this is part of how they grow within particular circles. Now, for my work, I looked really at university kind of study circles. So it's a very particular type of Salafism. But you saw that they were incredibly organized, not only there, but in sending training preachers, sending them to villages, studying the ways that they should speak, kind of having top tips of how to approach people, what topics seem to be better for individuals to talk to. So it's a very kind of complex, but intellectually kind of engaged movement. You know, they were very aware of what they were doing. And are very aware when they were kind of pushing buttons and when to push and when not to as well. As we saw in, I believe, 2011, one Salafi radio station was closed down for criticizing some of the practices of NU. I mean, they adapted to this very quickly and realized, well, actually, perhaps we shouldn't deride practices like Maulid, selling the Prophet's birthday, at least publicly, because this can get us in trouble. So you saw this kind of adaptability within the movement.
Well, just also want to ask, Chris, for individual Muslims, for many of the people you've met, I'm assuming that for these people, it was not a popular decision to become a Salafi in their family circles or perhaps in their peer group. And so that was a decision to become something quite distinctive within their communities and to take on an identity that perhaps a lot of people around them wouldn't have liked. Was that your feeling? And why were people happy to take on, to do something which might cause apprehension among their closest circles?
Yeah, so there's definitely a need to change your lifestyle and those that you hung around with. And you saw this at the kind of very particular level in the university campus, in the boarding houses you were in, the way that you were affiliated and associated on campus, trying to segregate yourself, but more thoroughly, yes, with your family and your previous friends. I mean, I don't think it's a mistake or kind of a coincidence that a lot of people join when they go to university and are essentially away from home, because when you spoke to a lot of these individuals, I mean, that telling their parents was one of those difficult conversations that they trained themselves for and was not necessarily always easy. I can give you an anecdotal example of one individual I met who was clean shaven. And when I asked him, well, why don't you have a beard, which is somewhat obligatory for Salafis, he was like, well, like I went home, my dad got very angry with me and forced me to shave it off. But yet, and this kind of perhaps talks to the communal dynamics of Salafism, of why it's quite popular. When he came back to his Salafi friends and kind of mentioned what had happened and didn't really know how to engage with his parents, but also with the movement, because he recognized that he should have a beard. It was through conversations that they said, well, you should have a beard, but at the same time, you should respect your parents. So perhaps the compromise situation in this one is that you've got the right to tent, but you can keep yourself clean shaven until you can convince your dad otherwise. So you see these battles that people have, this controversy. And that was only one of the individuals that told their parents. There was quite a few that didn't. So you did see this this break and this rupture, but it wasn't necessarily solely with individuals. There was also lifestyle changes. So listening to music, for example, sometimes even drinking alcohol, these kind of aspects of someone's life they would have to leave behind, and it wasn't always easy. Again, another anecdotal example is one individual I met who was fairly active in the movement. He used to be a guitarist in a heavy metal band, and he moved away from this, but secretly in conversations, he did admit that if he was driving down the streets and he heard one of his favorite songs, it's very difficult not to enjoy it. So there were these battles and these kind of needs to kind of segregate yourself, which is incredibly difficult in a society like Indonesia that is very kind of multicultural, very mixed. There's different kind of elements kind of going on. So yes, it's something that they constantly strive for, and I think they never necessarily saw it as an end goal. It was something that you're constantly developing towards.
One of the things that struck me about your book is you speak of many Salafis whom you met having believing that this was not only a personal journey for them, a spiritual process, but it was also something the country needed. And I must say, this really reminded me of my own research on the Muslim Brotherhood inspired groups like Tabia and PKS, when I would come across people, for example, who were very well placed within Nahdlatul Ulama. You know, they were people who they were connected into powerful networks, and they could have easily had a very successful career in that well-established Islamic organization and gone into politics or wherever they wanted to go. But nonetheless, they decided to take this turn. Let's not call it a conservative term perhaps, but they went into a completely different kind of Islamic organization. And one of the things was, it wasn't just for their own personal religiosity, but they desperately felt the country needed a different kind of Islam. And it was not really a radical agenda, but it was a much more pietistic agenda. They wanted Indonesia that was, and these are well-educated people, you know, who made this decision at university, like many of the people that you researched. And they felt that Indonesia needed much more professional, clean, I mean, not corrupt, forward-looking, morally upright people to lead the country, and they saw themselves as part of this vanguard. So that old slogan of Islam is the solution, they thought in their own lives, joining PKS would be something much better for Indonesia than them to stick with something that they felt hadn't provided answers that the country needed, or the Islamic community needed. So I don't know how that compares with the Salafis whom you interviewed.
No, for sure. I mean, and there's definitely kind of comparative kind of, well, there's similarities here, definitely, especially in that kind of like that broader message of saving the country. I think the mantra that was constantly quoted to me was save yourself, save your family, save the community. And that was the order that you would kind of go through. But ultimately that end goal was that piety had broken down because of that social cohesion had broken down in Indonesia, and Islam was the solution. And it was all about kind of propagation and kind of saving society. But an interesting kind of twist that you started to see within Salafi circles as well was the way that they kind of align this to more nationalist motifs, kind of slowly and incrementally. And it started with the more kind of aspirational dynamics. You really saw this engaging with probably Suharto-esque, that new order, the developmentalist kind of modernity, this idea of building up society. So it's no coincidence that a lot of those that I spoke to were from science and technical kind of institutions. So the idea was that you save yourself, but part of saving society is using these skills you learned at university to better society. That could be creating your own cottage industries. It could be through welfare dynamics. But equally with that, they started to kind of take on very other kind of parts of this kind of discourse, the kind of the differences between urban centers and the kind of the village lifestyle, and kind of mixed it into their own mantra, that there was this kind of intellectualism behind it, but also Indonesia's own kind of like Islamic history. Increasingly so, you saw individuals kind of talk about Salafism as kind of the continuation of a movement that you saw just before independence, you know, this social reformism that came with Muhammadiyah, the creation of new schools in West Sumatra. So I'd be interested to know how similar this is actually with the PKS and how they kind of align, but you definitely saw very similar kind of dynamics of this trying to build up Indonesia and kind of correct it.
Yeah. And that one of the things I heard repeatedly was people saying that they felt that existing movements had failed. You know, Nahdlatul Ulama, Muhammadiyah, Islamic parties, they had all been a failure because Indonesia, though with a large majority Muslim population, nonetheless was not properly Islamic, was not sufficiently devout, and also was undermined by all these very immoral tendencies, whether it was corruption or whether it was narrow self-interest, and so that seems to have been, if there was an idealism, that was a key part of it. And I think one of the things that Tabia people often used to say when you're talking about, save yourself, save your family, your community, was this building blocks. And, in this case, for the Muslim Brotherhood groups, they had these usra, literally family, these small cells on campus, very closely knit, 8 to 10 people with a leader, a murabi, and that was the building block. And everyone in the cell helped to keep each other true to this journey. And then the cells led to something, you were part of a bigger movement, and gradually you could see something growing, like bricks being put into a wall, and Indonesia would be the beneficiary in the longer term. So so it's interesting that this is, I know you talk a lot about globalization, and people often, sometimes you see writers talk about this as something that was imposed upon Indonesia or infected Indonesia, but in actual fact, when you talk to people, there's this sense of them seeking a different paradigm. And that's what perhaps Salafism, but certainly Muslim Brotherhood, Hizbut Tahrir, as you say, something that they felt was going to give them a better chance of success. Yeah.
Sure.
I also wanted to, I'm not sure if you want to say any more on that, Chris, but I also wanted to talk about the supposed Saudi role, because this also relates to that element that Salafism is popular because the Saudis have provided vast funding for it and a lot of organizational support and the like, and that we wouldn't have such a proliferating Salafi movement in Indonesia had it not been for that Saudi Gulf funding for it. And you address this in your book, and I wonder if we might talk about this as well, because insofar as people believe that Salafism poses a threat, that seems to be one part of it, that it's linked to Arabization and that this is something that's contaminating this previously very benign form of Indonesian Islam. So be interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
No, for sure. I mean, we can't discount the influence of Saudi, or to be fair, it's not just Saudi, it's money that came from Yemen, from Kuwait, from Gulf states as well. Saudi probably being one of the larger donors, yeah. We can't kind of deny that it was there. And in fact, if we look at Salafis quantitatively in Indonesia, I mean, they're actually a very small group compared to Nahdlatul Ulama or so forth. I mean, it's very difficult to count their numbers, but in terms of the tens of millions, they're not on that level. But what the funding originally has done is allowed them to essentially punch above their weight in terms of creating schools, extremely sophisticated schools, and online kind of tools and learning kind of platforms. And we definitely saw this in the 1980s, where that reliance on funding streams, initially through the Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia and its connections within the Middle East, really got the first initial Salafi scholars. First of all, it allowed them to train within Saudi Arabia, and then come back and use those experiences to build up a network. It was quite a small network to begin with. You saw kind of mosques starting, kind of small kind of seed funds, but it did grow over time. But interestingly, while it grew in the 1990s, you saw Salafis become a bit more independent from that initial funding stream with the Dewan Dakwah Islamiyah Indonesia, and be able to contact people individually. The global war on terror did essentially change the dynamics here. You saw certain Salafis gain greater funding than others, depending on where they fit on the political spectrum. Those affiliated to Jafar Talib and the Laskar Jihad somewhat lost out in this regard. But the interesting dynamic too is that while the funding has not necessarily be completely switched off, you have seen Salafis be able to kind of take advantage of this step up, perhaps, to really create their own schools and their own funding streams themselves. And they might be quite small comparatively to Nahdlatul Ulama or Muhammadiyah, but they're still somewhat significant. A lot of their schools get accreditation internationally. They've started an online university. They're able to send their brightest students abroad to study. And even in the initial years of the Syrian civil war, we saw them sending volunteers to help distribute aid. So you see this new kind of funding stream kind of coming in, which somewhat complements this kind of dynamic. I suppose on top of that, like when we talk about Saudi Arabia, an interesting other dynamic that you saw was the role that Saudi Arabia plays in the imagination, really, for a lot of Salafis as a quote unquote kind of perfect society. And this really came up in this emotive plea that, well, actually Saudi Arabia is somewhere that respects Islamic traditions. Friday is a day off work, unlike in Indonesia, where it's the Saturday and the Sunday. And everyone goes to the mosque, everyone eats together afterwards. A lot of this was very kind of romanticized type of imagery, but it was imagery nonetheless to show you those kind of links that it plays and the important role it plays in showing that there is an alternative that we can turn to in this world. And that's kind of backed up as well in the literature that they produce too. So in a lot of Salafi magazines, when it comes to kind of religious rulings, there is still this kind of deference to scholars within the Middle East. And you see this in the way that they usually defer from creating fatwa themselves, but will refer to the guidance that they've seen somewhere else. So you've got this kind of almost hierarchy. Now, having said that, there's still a lot of space for interpretation when it comes to a fatwa. So I mean, there's still this kind of elasticism on the ground and this variance that you see in Indonesia, which is why Salafism kind of does fragment. But yeah, Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula plays an important role in financial kind of imaginary, but also kind of doctrinal kind of avenues.
I suppose, Chris, we were talking about this growing influence or penetration of transnational movements. And that's one of the things that's often cited by their detractors, that the deference you spoke of, and sometimes commands coming from abroad, that those representatives of those transnational movements in Indonesia feel obliged or forced to follow. So Hizbut Tahrir is a very good case. We've had quite well documented now how the central leadership of Hizbut Tahrir, I think at the time still in Amman, Jordan, made a decision that senior people within the Indonesian branch of chapter of Hizbut Tahrir were to be removed, and so they were. And there is a continuing kind of suspicion that a lot of decisions made by PKS reflect the views of the international Muslim Brotherhood, or really the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood leadership. You know, I personally am rather skeptical about that, but nonetheless, this is one of the things that's said about transnational groups, that that they are not autonomous within Indonesia. And so I wonder how you feel about that. It sort of goes to this issue of whether they're a branch office of something that's actually being run from somewhere else, or in actual fact, what we have is something really quite thoroughly Indonesianized, and the external influence is actually not very great.
No, it's a fantastic kind of comparison here as well, because we're talking about organizations that essentially have different models, don't they, internationally? Yeah. Yeah. And this is where Salafism comes into a different dynamic, perhaps, because there is no one core or center of Salafism. In fact, there's disagreements throughout the world. I mean, there's deference to scholars within the Arabian Peninsula, but they don't necessarily agree with themselves. So you see those fragments kind of coming into Indonesia, and which gives a bit more kind of elasticity to the movement. But it also means that what Salafism means in Indonesia is very different from other countries. Take, for example, when I was doing my initial field work, this was just after the Arab Spring, where you saw a lot more Salafis in Egypt coming engaged with politics. In Indonesia, there were debates about this, but it was pretty much unanimous that was not a model that they were going to follow. But that didn't necessarily mean that what was happening in Egypt wasn't Salafism. So there was a lot more variance for that contextualization, which is kind of interesting for a movement that purports to be quite literalist. And I think we saw that in Indonesia by the way that Salafis form as well. So they predominantly work through foundations, which are very decentralized, quite purposely so, I suppose, in Indonesia. They're a bit muddy around the edges of what they really mean legally. But that was quite convenient as a model for Salafis themselves. So they could join, if you had a prominent preacher, they'll be in charge or on the board of 3 or 4 different foundations doing very different things, which gave them this kind of versatility. But it also meant that when Salafis were working in kind of urban areas, they were far more kind of attuned to what was going on there, and they had a lot of room to maneuver there that they wouldn't have if there was a clear line of authority coming from the Middle East or from somewhere in Indonesia itself. So it's an interesting comparison, and this is just where the different types of movements that you can actually have and the different type of models that they take on can really count for what happens on the ground in a lot of ways. So,
yeah. Well, specifically on the question of the local, and one of the things that I think you described in a very sort of subtle way in your book is how important that local context is. I mean, you were mainly doing your research in Yogyakarta, but I know you've looked at other aspects. You mentioned one of the largest Salafi organisations, Wada Islamiyah, is something you've written about elsewhere. And we see elements of what I suppose we might roughly call Indonesianisation. We begin to see people wearing batik shirts, some Salafis wearing batik shirts and wearing perhaps a black felt cap, which more associated with more traditional forms of Indonesian Islam. But we see this kind of adaptation going on to local circumstances. So when we call these movements transnational, that it's only really an accurate term up to a certain point. So can you talk a little bit more about how, I suppose the question is, it's not as if Salafism is transplanted to Indonesia from the Middle East. And so that's the variations of Salafism you get in Indonesia are exactly as you would get in the Middle East. So we're getting the production of something that's distinctive to Indonesia. So tell us a little more about this local element.
Sure. So I suppose when Salafis in Indonesia organize, there are certain kind of practical demands on them. They have to align to kind of Indonesian norms. They have to register when they go into mosques. If they've started a village, they have to have a village head. They have to form kind of foundations. Increasingly, they have to register under the Ministry of of Religious Affairs if they're conducting an activity. But also at the same time, they're competing with different Islamic groups, different kind of student groups if they're in the university campus. And this all attributes to a broad, much more thorough discursive shift in the way that they talk about the movement. You see this in the way that they have to compete, perhaps, with Nahdlatul Ulama at certain points, and adapt their behavior as well to be not so confrontational in specific environments. Subtly critiquing kind of groups is quite a skill in this sense, but you have to kind of make yourself quite distinct, but also not too distinct, if that makes sense. You can't be too far away from people's everyday realities and stuff. You have to show why your message should resonate with someone. And there's a very kind of, this is where on university campuses they start to talk about issues of kind of morality, intellectualism, tying this into a broader lifestyle, into kind of your life choices that you make, the clothes you wear, but also giving, and I think this is important, this is why it becomes quite local, giving people a sense of agency. I mean, when Salafis propagate, I mean, it's an obligation that once you're part of the Salafi fold, you try and bring other people into it. But exactly how you do that, especially when you don't have an organizational head, is really somewhat up to you. So what you saw a lot of the times in cities like Yogyakarta is kind of students start to kind of create popular products like bags, T-shirts with Salafi slogans on them, kind of fashionable kind of new books that kind of adapted kind of movie titles from popular Indonesian kind of sinetron, for example. And this kind of shows you that there is this kind of like this adaptation and these kind of different dynamics kind of going forth. Now, exactly where this is also where the fragmentation happens, because when a student, for example, will create an outlet making Salafi themed t-shirts that are quite popular, others will dispute that as well. You're just making a profit. You're not actually that, and that's coming first. So that this isn't a form of propagation. Therefore, what you're doing is wrong. Others will disagree. And this is why the movement is quite local, but also the disagreements that you're seeing are quite kind of vibrant and on the ground, and really don't play out in that kind of international arena. They're really playing out in a very kind of small environment, be it the mosque, be it the campus, be it a city. And I find that's the fascinating part of the movement, and actually part of its strength, really, if you can have those debates on the ground without them being shut down.
Well, I suppose one of the questions that arises with this, Chris, is you mentioned that they have to tailor their messages to local circumstances in order to be able to engage with people and not attract a highly adverse or aggressive reaction from local communities. But the question is, so they could adopt as a tactic that they will not directly critique or oppose, say, traditional practices that are much beloved in the community, you know, celebrating the Prophet's birthday, praying at grave sites, all those sorts of things that we know could be very contentious issues. But the question is, underlying the strategy, have their views actually changed, or will they change over time? So if we've seen this sort of Indonesianized adaptation taking place, will that over time change Salafism in a more permanent way? Or is the intention of those Salafists who are altering their approach, is that just a short-term measure, and when they can, they would return to a more doctrinaire position? I'm thinking here of post-Islamism, you know, this discussion that Islamist parties, if they're going to be successful, they have to move beyond a very strict ideological agenda, because they just won't be successful. But nonetheless, inside them, they still have that agenda there. Is there a parallel here with Salafism?
For sure, definitely. And it's interesting kind of talking that you mentioned kind of post-Islamism as well, because I suppose when we're talking about the Salafis that I'm talking about, they have been labeled as quietist Salafis, you know, not the explicitly political or the more jihadist kind of trends. But I suppose the act of becoming Salafi and the kind of values that you take on and the way that you propagate into society is inherently a political act, isn't it? So it really kind of ties into this debate of where we think the kind of Islamism starts and finishes. But I in the Salafi sense, and this is the interesting thing of this fragmentation, is there are genuine parts of it that move into that more political arena. Now, not all of it. I mean, people do dispute what to do, but they are reading necessarily from the same doctrine. They're just the interpretation there is somewhat different. So you have seen these, and you also see very incremental kind of shifts to the environment that they're in. So, for example, when it comes to how you engage with the current Indonesian government or the previous Indonesian government, most Salafis will say that there is you have to be obedient to whoever's in charge. I mean, the way that you give advice is subtly, privately, and so forth. But I mean, within that as well, I mean, you've seen initially kind of very practical steps to participate in elections, despite the fact that they believe democracy to be a man-made government in contravention of the kind of Quran and Sharia. And that turned out, that initially was very practical, like we should vote Muslims in rather than people that aren't Muslim, mainly because it's better for us, to more coherent more coherent engagement of what that actually means. We saw that around the Ahok or the gubernatorial election, in 2017 in Jakarta, where there was a far more comprehensive idea of who should be elected in and who shouldn't. And this is almost kind of like the ratcheting of this kind of this this idea of politics, one aspect leads to another, leads to another. Now, it doesn't necessarily always lead into, we need to form a political party, we need to form an Islamic state. It forms this more kind of majoritarian kind of idea that, well, we live in a state that should uphold Islamic values, and who's going to uphold those values? It will be Muslims. So in terms of, we've seen this here, and whether we're going to see it kind of move backwards is an interesting kind of question. I think it's one that time can tell. And this really also talks to the other dynamic in this, and that's how does the state approach Salafis? I mean, we know in the previous epoch of Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, there was quite a there's a lot of what do you say, the policy of kind of closeness, of proximity with local governments. That has somewhat changed. You see the Salafis themselves trying to roll back on their more extreme political kind of statements. We saw that in the 2019 election, where up until the actual election, you saw this very subtle, somewhat motivated kind of support for Prabowo. I mean, he wasn't outright supported. I mean, they're aware of who he is. But immediately after the election, when it became clear that he lost, you saw very much this retraction of like, well, we need to just respect the election and who won. So you do see this kind of ambiguity kind of emerging again. And I think this is because there is this awareness that being Salafi at the moment is not necessarily beneficial in terms of politics. So.
Well, it strikes me also that one of the things we see in PKS is this constant tension that the imperatives of politics create among the more ideologically driven, ideologically driven membership of the party, because people joined the organisation because they were serious about doctrine, they were serious about their personal practice. And so some of these cherished notions that you may have to dispense with, at least in public, are still, I think, still feature very prominently in the internal discussions. So you get this almost dramaturgy where you have what is said to the public. So formally, PKS, like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, sort of pre the Morsi or pre Arab Spring, playing this post-Islamist role. We will work with everyone. We will not be insisting upon comprehensive Shariaization of the statutes. We will not be demanding an Islamic state. And so all those things that 10 years ago a lot of people would have regarded as an important part of their agenda. But nonetheless, so that notion that we think of Egypt, the moment the Muslim Brotherhood held power, they relinquished a lot of that post-Islamist kind of agenda, that more inclusive, more compromising agenda, and reverted to what they knew best. So the default setting was still one of Islamism, even though the party itself says, oh no, we're not interested in Islamism, we're just a religious nationalist organisation. So the notion that there can be a tactic, a facade of that gives a much softer image, but within and internal discussions are still very much focused on all those canons of belief that brought those groups together.
I think an interesting kind of Indonesian example to kind of attach onto that too, that you've seen in kind of the Salafi-inspired kind of Wadha Islamiyah, so one of the largest Salafi organizations, it was the promotion of something called Wasatiyah democracy. So Wasatiyah meaning kind of essentially moderation in Islam. And it was a very particular idea at a very particular time that they brought up, this idea that we're not going to be, Islam doesn't have a place in terms of being a political party, but the ulama should be essentially a second estate. It should be somewhere between the politicians and the people to make sure anything that goes between them aligns with Islamic tenets. And you got a very clear image of where they actually saw themselves or where they saw Islam within the kind of political environment, which is a fascinating kind of insight, really.
Yeah. Well, talking about politics, we know that in some parts of the Muslim world, we do have Salafist parties, you know, in Egypt and Yemen and Tunisia and the like, but we don't have a Salafist party in Indonesia. And to my knowledge, there's not really an overtly Salafist politician in the national domain, in the national parliament or what have you. Why is that? Why haven't, you spoke before about the sort of more quietist trend within Salafism. Why hasn't Salafism taken on a more overtly political role in Indonesia?
I suppose on a practical level, the bar of entry into Indonesian politics is relatively high. So in terms of financing and just trying to get there, it's in itself is fairly difficult, especially for someone that's purporting to be very Salafi. But I suppose a part of this, another part of that answer is that they found another convenient avenue, and that kind of really speaks to the work that Michael Buller was doing on Sharia kind of laws and bylaws, where they can act almost as a kind of lobby for whoever's going up for election. And essentially this idea that, like, well, you support part of our agenda or give us space, and we'll use the ears of everyone that we can kind of reach to promote your kind of values. Again, we saw this, and we also actually saw the complexity of this as well, because I mean, that it sounds great as a tactic on paper, but in actuality, I recall being in South Sulawesi during the gubernatorial election, where one group was essentially trying to promote this amongst the different politicians, but they couldn't necessarily decide who, because each one of them tried to court them. So they were stuck in this bind that in the end they didn't go for anyone really. So on the ground, it's far more kind of difficult than not. But I think an important part of that as well is that they necessarily did have the ear of everyone that they wanted to talk to. So whether they were able to kind of shift votes or not, the idea of having this network of mosques really speaks to a certain political power or political influence, whether it's real or not. And I think that's something that they've recognized. And I think that's one of the reasons that you see less individuals trying to enter politics directly, because there is this other route.
And perhaps that also relates to the diffusion we've seen of Islam's political influence across the spectrum. You know, once upon a time, people would have directed their Islamic aspirations through avowedly Islamic parties, but now there are all sorts of choices you have of parties that might actually champion your agenda or be willing to agree to your agenda when it comes to local bylaws or legislation in the national parliament and the like. Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I was going to ask just a little more about the Wasatiyah program for Wada Islamiyah, and this is just a very interesting example because we know that the Indonesian government itself formally adopted this notion. They had a big international conference a few years ago, hosted by the former chairman of Muhammadiyah, Din Shamsuddin, and they also, with great fanfare, announced the taking up of this idea of Wasatiyah, that this was going to be moderate Islam in the centre, and so this was to become a catch cry. But the kind of Wasatiyah that Wada Islamiyah has in mind is quite different from the kind of Wasatiyah that the Indonesian government has in mind. So can you talk a little bit about what the practicalities of this Wasatiyah was? Because I've got the impression from your writings on this that this is a really interesting practical example of this adaptation taking place.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Wasatiyah is one of those things that we've seen in quite a few different arenas. I think Najib Razak in Malaysia, when he was prime minister, promoted it. Yusuf Qaradawi has promoted it as well. But with Wada Islamiyah, the interesting thing, and this is something that is in the process of being developed, is that it didn't necessarily feel very, can you say, kind of doctrinal. Every time it was expressed more of a kind of political aspirations. So when you talk about, well, what does Wasatiyah actually mean? You just be like, well, it's not extreme right, like Jemaah Islamiyah and the kind of militant Islam that we see. And it's not extreme left, like communism or liberalism. It's in the middle. So we respect the unitary state of Indonesia, and we support it. And you couldn't really get much further than that. Now, it might have changed in the last year or so during COVID. I mean, this is something that they're about to have another mukama. I'll be interested to kind of find out what their internal talks are about this. But it was very much kind of framed in political senses rather than doctrinal. And they were still trying to kind of work that part out, which was interesting. But they did necessarily say that it wasn't like the others. That was clear enough.
It's interesting because everyone in Indonesian politics at the moment is trying to crowd into the centre, at least discursively. And the Minister of Religious Affairs has this moderasi beragama, this religious moderation program, and it's specifically saying that we have to invite people from the left and the right into the centre. The centre is the place to be. That's where there is balance and proportion and Enu's talking this way, but of course defining where the centre is, that's a great challenge, isn't it? Because you're often defining it in opposition to something, that left or right that you were just talking about, but different organisations have an entirely different perception of where that centre is. So no one wants to be seen as extreme or an outlier, do they? Everyone wants to be in that point. I was just struck, an organisation or a Salafist group that had put such emphasis upon doctrinal purity, to talk about wasatiyah or to be something in the middle, that itself might create some tension.
No, for sure. I mean, and it did within what has let me. I suppose this happened in the context of the gubernatorial elections in Jakarta. What I was initially quite involved in that, or the central leadership was. And the branches were somewhat uneased by the primary focus Jakarta and Jakarta politics was playing in it. But another interesting dynamic, I suppose, when we talk about the center, is the way that the center actually kind of moves around itself, doesn't it? And this is what we see in Indonesia, and this is one of the challenges with kind of Muslim majoritarianism, is that part of the language that they adopt and part of what we've seen in Indonesia is what considered to be the center ground shifting somewhat. And we see that even with the current administration in the way that they're meant to be opposed somewhat to this kind of more militant kind of, I suppose, kind of version of what conservatism is meant to be. But at the same time, there seems to be a giving way of the finer kind of edges as well. So we're seeing that kind of shift a bit.
Well, let's talk about this notion of majoritarian democracy, and particularly Islamic majoritarianism, Chris, because there's been quite a lot of scholarly writing about this, and much of it comes back to this period of mobilisation against Ahok in 2016, 2017, and that very strong sense that I felt a lot of Muslims at the time had, that this was the defeat of Ahok was a great victory. The fact that there would have been hundreds of thousands of Muslims who took to the streets of Jakarta, probably the biggest demonstration ever, that it would have almost forced the government to, and President Jokowi to begin legal proceedings or prosecution of Ahok when he clearly didn't want to. People took this as evidence of the democratic system being responsive to Muslim demands and Muslim outpourings, even though in lots of terms, in terms of rule of law, it was probably a very negative thing, because the government felt compelled. There were clearly resistance in the police to prosecute Ahok, but everyone felt compelled to do this in order to try and diffuse this situation of massive mobilisation. So the notion that this was a vindication of the kind of democracy that Indonesia had, that people could take to the streets in such overwhelming numbers and the government would listen, rather than there being some basic rule of law notion and due process which would be followed, rather than, I think the Tempo magazine called it mobocracy at the time. But my impression, and many Muslim intellectuals have written with pride about that, about the sheer show of force, the majority speaking, was really what democracy is about. So I struggle to find signs of where this majoritarian sentiment will be rolled back. I'm rather pessimistic. I think it will strengthen before it gets weaker. And as it strengthens, it will do more and more harm to Indonesia's democratic credibility. I don't know what you think about this, Chris.
No, for sure. I completely agree. I think the Ahok case was a pinnacle to it. I mean, we saw these groups quickly kind of fragment or go back into their camps afterwards. But what was very evident is that the political force is there to be kind of tapped into, should the need arise and should the organizational kind of ability to be there. I mean, what we saw on the streets at the time was, it took most people by surprise that you could mobilize that many people and bring them to Jakarta so quickly. But it was also the network of mosques that were used to mobilize people. And it kind of it's quite striking that they have access to voices and grassroots programs that most people are quite envious to have, really. So it's there, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon, really.
Yeah. And the remarkable thing about, we talk a great deal about the fragmentation, and we see that movement that fragmented very quickly with a lot of help from the government, and it's cracked down, of course, but how it fragmented very quickly. But nonetheless, you see the kind of the latency of it, the potential that suddenly all these disparate networks find a cause around which they can unite and mobilize. And very quickly, Islam assumes a power which no other force in Indonesian society probably can have in that regard. So for all the shortcomings of political Islam, nonetheless, any leading politician or party is going to be very wary of any issue which might provoke those networks into action again.
Yeah, for sure. And an interesting kind of side dynamic to this, or a side note on this as well, is the question of who can mobilize these individuals. Because in the last election, and Prabowo kind of moving into the cabinet, a lot of these individuals feel somewhat quite burnt of those bridges that they had. So, and even when Anies, they support him, but he was quite upfront that they would not get any kind of positions around him. So in that sense, it'll be interesting to see what demands might be made and who's able to kind of mobilize and gain the trust that's kind of needed in this sense. Is it just going to be trying to kind of vote out someone that you think is or vote for the lesser of two evils, or is there going to be some type of energy that we saw in 2017 again? So.
And doesn't also that point to a failure of Islamic movements, and indeed transnational Islamic movements in a way, because none of them had produced a charismatic figure, someone around whom people can coalesce, someone who would be a credible political leader, possibly even a presidential candidate. We have figures like Habib Rizik, the now jailed leader of the now banned Islamic Defenders Front, was put forward as a potential presidential candidate, but no one would ever take him as a serious candidate. Outside of a small section of the community, he hasn't got support. So in a way, this failure to produce national level leaders might also say something about transnational movements themselves, and about how, certainly for a PKS setting, it's the collective, it's the organisation, it's the movement that's important, and there's a certain suspicion to someone who is seen to have an outsized ego or can reach far beyond the organisation. And it may be the same in Salafism as well. But I remember one of the criticisms about Jafar Umar-Talib, who you mentioned before, was that he was appearing too much on TV, becoming a celebrity and the like, and that this didn't sit well, perhaps, with some of the principles of Salafism. So for PKS, I think there's an element of that as well. I'm interested in your thoughts. Yeah.
No, for sure. I mean, Jafar Umar-Talib's downfall, a lot of that had to do with the fact that he enjoyed the media limelight, and his Salafi followers around him saw this as somewhat contravening the actual reason that they were fighting. It wasn't for politics, it was to defend Muslims. And interestingly, with Salafism as well, one of the dynamics is that most of those very prestigious scholars that we talk about, so Al-Albani, Bin Baz, Al-Wadi. I mean, most of them passed away 20 years ago. And they're really, while there are prominent scholars now, there's no one that really carries the same weight that could actually kind of shift a movement behind something. So this is, again, this talks to kind of like this local dynamic and the fact that there isn't a transnational leader of any sort. So yeah, I mean, I suppose this is part of the reason that we see them in the Indonesian kind of political sphere, moving in and out and becoming involved in different ways, because there's no one around to say whether this is what's right and what's wrong, really, apart from themselves and yeah, and their interpretation of text.
Well, one last thing, Margaret, if we have time, I just wanted to raise, and that was, you know, the conservative turn has had the response from the government, which one might term the conservative rollback or the attempted Islamist rollback that we've seen again. So much comes back to this event, this seismic event in a way in Jakarta in 2016, 2017 against Ahok. And the government does seem to have pursued in a very systematic way a multi-pronged attack on Islamist groups and on those people who are not just a political threat, but also whom they see as an existential doctrinal threat to Indonesia. And people in particular who hold conservative Islamic views. We see this in the banning of organisations like Hizbut Tahrir in 2017 and the Islamic Defenders Front, you know, at the end of last year. We also see this in the purge of the public service. We see this in some of the campaigns that the government is launching about religious moderation, which indirectly are targeting groups that hold the kinds of views that Salafists would hold, or PKS members and the like. And there you feel as if some of the people behind this campaign have a notion that Indonesia, that these groups are don't really have a place in Indonesia, that they stand at cross purposes to the reason that this country that Indonesia was founded. So I'm just wondering, from what you can detect in Salafist groups and other groups, how much this government crackdown is being felt by them.
Well, I suppose on an everyday level, they aren't necessarily feeling it in terms of their schools being closed down or anything like that. They're fairly above board and transparent, but you do see it in the way that they're framed, the framing around Salafism. There is a lot more out there now, a lot more public literature that will talk about the violence behind them. It will attribute a lot of their kind of doctrine to other groups such as Jamaah Islamiyah. So you see this push to box Salafism into something that's very foreign. It's kind of very threatening in a way. And the response from the Salafi side is essentially to go out of their way to prove they're not. And they do that through, you see that through the use of Indonesian flags in certain sermons now. You see it in registering with the Ministry of Religious Affairs for events. You see it being very more kind of transparent, very much more open of where they sit within Indonesia. And quite frankly, also saying that, yes, we are conservative, but we're not violent, and really pushing that kind of message. And it's interesting it will be interesting in the next couple of years as we approach the presidential election of whether they maintain this line, whether Islamic groups will, or we'll see cracks and opportunities emerge that maybe the world, they think it's time to actually make a push again and try and open up space and change what's happening on the ground. So.
Well, there's some evidence, Chris, for some recent survey data that ANU commissioned, that to show that, for example, with PKS, I think it's much harder to measure the Salafi community because people can't so easily identify who Salafis are, the average Indonesian anyway. It's not like PKS, which is a party with a symbol and leadership and all the rest. But PKS, we've found in polarization surveys that they're now very much in the middle. There's not strong antipathy towards them that I suspect there would have been even 10 years ago. And so perhaps the kind of campaign that they have conducted to appear to be in the centre and no longer a kind of hardline ideological organisation, perhaps it's worked. And perhaps the things you were saying that the Salafists are doing, we're saying, well, yes, we're conservative, but we're not a threat to the state, and we're not, a seditious organisation or something like that. That may also, in time, people see this as a very legitimate thing. That freedom of religious expression should allow people to have very conservative views as long as they're not a threat to the state.
For sure. And if we're talking about PKS, I mean, they're one of the very few opposition parties that Indonesia currently has.
Right.
So,
yeah.
So, yeah.
And they do talk about that. They do talk about democratic principles requiring an opposition, a loyal opposition. And I think it's possible to argue that they're performing that role. And despite their Islamist background, in fact, they do take seriously democratic principles. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely.
So I want to jump in. I want to thank you both. This has been a wide-ranging and wonderfully interesting conversation going in many directions. I'm going to take my prerogative to push back a little on the way the conversation has gone towards the end of, it's like PKS and Salafis are kind of very similar. And I want to focus on doctrine about Salafis, which Chris, you are an expert on. You describe how many Salafis believe that all non-Muslims are kafir, and that the political system is there to have Muslims rule it, and then they can protect the non-Muslims at the best of chances. That's very different than what, Greg, you just said about PKS actually absorbing and embracing democratic principles. So where is this Muslim majoritarianism in the scheme of things, Chris? I mean, is it like PKS or is it different?
I think it's a brilliant question, and I suppose if we're looking at Muslim majoritarianism, one of the interesting aspects of it is perhaps it's non-institutionalized and non-particular. There seems to be an agreement, perhaps, amongst different Muslim groups that yes, there needs to be a greater role for a preeminent role for Muslims, but exactly where they come from on the doctrinal level can somewhat differ. And I remember, the example of where non-Muslims sit. This idea that, well, they are kafir, but they need to be protected, was something that was definitely brought up in certain kind of forums, the Salafi forums. But that wasn't universal across the Salafi movement. In fact, when you move to a group like Wahda Islamiyah, they're far more kind of open to this idea of like, well, Indonesia was essentially, the founding fathers were all kind of Muslim. We have to protect that, but we have to also respect that there are minorities here that do have some rights of some sort. So there's a difference in practicality when they take it from a doctrinal or a kind of a political kind of point of view, I suppose. That's what I'm trying to say. But the feeling I got that it was very difficult to pin down one particular Muslim majoritarianism in a certain sense. There was a clear idea of who they were opposed to, or the broader brushstroke kind of ideas of what should be there. But in terms of what it meant on the ground, it was somewhat different. I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this too, Greg, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting question, Margaret. And for PKS, although they portray themselves as a very inclusive party and they make much of the Christian candidates, for example, who stand in Christian majority areas, nonetheless, there's what you might call a non-Muslim glass ceiling, and it's pretty low down in the party. If you're a non-Muslim, you can't rise very high, and there is no non-Muslim on any of the central boards and things like that. So in that regard, yes, they pay lip service to the principle that anyone from any religious background is able to become a candidate for the party, but the levers of power are absolutely held by people who are not just Muslim, but by people who are steeped in that Muslim Brotherhood-inspired ideology, doctrine that PKS has. And just one last anecdote from me, that the national meeting, Congress that not Congress, but it was a national meeting that the PKS held in 2008 to announce that it was no longer Islamist, but now religious nationalist. They held it in Bali at the Sunor, one of the big Sunor tourism hotels in Bali. And it was a very strange event because they were trying to show that they were open to everyone. But here were these PKS women, very conservatively dressed, brushing shoulders with people in skimpy bathers and things like that. And so you could see that they had a long way to go till they were really at ease with this new identity. The interesting thing was that they staged a cultural performance at the end of it, and the cultural performance was based on traditional Balinese dance. And basically the dance, the whole pitch of the performance was that there was chaos until this white turbaned figure appeared on stage and put an end to all the anarchy. And the figure was clearly intended to be the Prophet Muhammad. And PKS people thought this was a wonderful performance. And they don't need to look around at the Balinese staff watching this to get a sense of how someone who was not in their community might have seen this particular performance. That Islam was the saviour for them, that the Prophet Muhammad was the one who was going to bring a golden age. And so it was a rather clunky start to this very inclusive message that PKS had to non-Muslims.
We'll see if the Salafi movement becomes big enough that they'll have to do something that shows their colors too.
Yes.
I want to go to the questions. I want to start with Sydney Jones. She asks, how are the Islamists in Jogja reacting to Jokowi's anti-radicalization campaign? Is there any suggestion that they should seek a candidate to back in 2024, or that it's better to sit out the election, especially after the way they were portrayed by Prabowo in 2019? What kind of backlash has emerged?
It's a great question. And it's one that's constantly developing. So the backlash on the ground in Yogyakarta, at least, and I'm saying this with the fact that because of COVID, it's been very difficult to kind of get onto the ground and get more than just kind of the perspectives of the people you talk to. It is one where there seems to be this kind of this threat kind of hanging over their heads, but at the same time, it hasn't actually necessarily evolved into anything yet. There are fears of what this means on university campuses in terms of the freedom to kind of move around. This is part of the reason that you see the use of Indonesian flags. It's become more common in a lot of these kind of themes. There's a lot more kind of transparency when it comes to the activities that they're doing, trying to make sure that everything's online, everything's above board. Not emphasizing necessarily the kind of international dynamics. For example, they giving kind of charity to kind of countries that might be seen as too far on that kind of Islamist kind of scale. So there seems to be this kind of rolling back in terms of what it means for the next election. I mean, it's an interesting thing that's kind of developing on the ground, and is developing in conjunction with COVID. There have been responses, and this is part of the fact that Salafism is very popular in kind of science medical institutions, that the Indonesian government's handling of COVID is something that they lament, something they're opposing, something that they initially got behind Anies Baswedan in Jakarta for kind of criticizing Jokowi for. Now, because of what's happened with the FPE and Habib Rizek and so forth, we're seeing kind of a bit of a rollback of this as well. In terms of if there is a kind of ideal candidate that's coming up, it will be interesting to kind of watch that space, but at this moment it's perhaps too soon and they're still quite burnt from what happened last time, I'd say.
Greg, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, Anies is the most obvious of the candidates who have fairly strong polling figures at the moment, but and of course, he went very quickly to see Habib Rizik when he returned to Jakarta. And so he continues to keep an iron in that particular fire. And he's obviously looking to Islamists as potential source of support. But I think also he's a very flexible politician, and there are no guarantees for the Islamists. And that's their dilemma, I think.
So I'm going to put together two questions. One is from Wayne Forrest, who wants to go back a bit to the beginning of, did Salafism grow with the backing and the support from elements within the Indonesian security establishment? And I'm sorry for my dog. And if that connection exists, does it continue to today? Is it akin to previous backing of Preman groups? And then this is another one of sources of Salafism. Is corruption and religious deviance a cause of Indonesians embracing Salafism? First to Chris then.
Sure. So fantastic questions. I suppose going back to the beginning of how Salafism kind of entered into Indonesia, those links with security services, at least to the Salafism that I'm talking about here, were not necessarily that apparent. It was more the Muhammad Natsirs, the DDI, so the Dewan Dakwah Islami Indonesia, and those kind of elements that linked the first generation of Salafis to the Middle East that were far more prominent in that sense. Now, that kind of did shift over time, especially if we're looking to those early years of the Reformasi, where you saw Jafar al-Muttalib kind of mobilize for the Laskar Jihad and gain a certain amount of support from different elements within military circles, unofficially at least. So you did see that kind of emerge, but that did disappear equally as quickly as well. So, I mean, an interesting tangent from that as well, I'd say, is that there are, to this day, certain links. Some of these are practical. The Salafis themselves will usually try and kind of socialize any activity they have with security services on the ground, but you did see in de-radicalization programs, at least under Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, approachment to Salafi scholars to help assist on the ground with explaining the kind of nuances of kind of Islam within kind of schools or within Kabupatens, on regencies or in mosques. So those links are there, and they're not necessarily that kind of always necessarily that nefarious. In terms of corruption and deviance, I mean, these are aspects that would usually come up when you were talking to an individual of why they shifted into Salafism. There was this idea that, well, actually, kind of studying at university kind of opened their eyes to the fact that people were kind of drinking and there's this other side to society, or they didn't feel at ease at home and they suddenly had the chance to kind of explore and find a different environment. But it was always kind of expressed with this kind of like this almost communal optimism as well, that the individuals around them were going to help them kind of they were going to protect each other from these corrupting elements that they saw. An interesting aspect to add to that as well, I'd say, it's the emphasis on clarity that everyone brought up as well. And this is where the big kind of difference with NU or Nahdlatul Ulama really came from when you spoke to individuals that came from Nahdlatul Ulama families, that they said, well, actually, the reverence of a kiai, the kind of the kind of inability to kind of talk to kind of individuals at the top or kind of get clarity on kind of Islamic tenets is something that drove them to Salafism. And they'd always bring up the ideal that you could ride in a car with the preacher, that you could WhatsApp them, you could kind of talk to them afterwards, they would have a snack with them. And this really kind of this egalitarian, but also this ability to kind of ask any question and get the answer was very much at the forefront of their thinking. I think you might be on mute.
No, I was just thinking would I need to respond to that, but I think it's fine. I'm happy to go on to the next question. Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go to Nava Nuriana's question. Hi, Chris, she says to you, could you talk about the extent of Wada Islamia's links to the political Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, be it in conferences that Zaitun Rasmin has attended in the Middle East, or the literature read by Wada Islamiyah members? Thanks.
No, it's a fantastic question. And this kind of attests also to Wada Islamiyah's kind of own kind of blending of kind of originating in kind of more Tarbiyah and kind of Ikhwan Muslim kind of circles, but then taking on this kind of almost Salafi kind of nuance afterwards. And you see that in the way that they kind of they organize their Tarbiyah and kind of essentially they're in mass. It's in terms of kind of like where the literature that they draw from at the moment. This is a question that unfortunately they were in the process of rewriting most of their kind of literature back when they decided that Islam Wasatiyah was an issue for theirs, and I haven't yet to see the latest version of their materials. They're going to have a Muqtama in the next couple of months. I'll be interested to try and find out or attend that online and perhaps gain a bit more of a clarity on that. But an interesting part when you're looking at the kind of the international kind of circles, and this is a bit of a side note on this one, but it's the increasing prominence, especially from 2017 onwards, that you saw Turkey playing within WADA international conferences and where they were kind of heading to. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the Gulf states were important. They still are as kind of funders and as places to study. But I found this greater emphasis on going to Turkey for international conferences to be kind of a fascinating kind of new development at the time. And perhaps talks to the rivalry we've seen internationally between kind of Saudi Arabia and Turkey on the kind of Islamic kind of international arena too. So, yeah.
This is
actually, Margaret, I just want to return to the previous question about the security services and Salafism, and to say there's a flip side to that coin, and that is the role of some of the security services in fomenting anti-Salafi thinking. So, you know, the previous questioner, Nava Nurania, has written very well about this, but former senior people in the intelligence community have got sufficient resources that have been able to conduct these training programs for INU members. And those training programs have a very strong anti-transnational Islam element to them. So very conservative Islamist organisations like the Islamic Defenders Front are seen as not being a problem, you know, because they're basically similar kind of creed to INU. But the ones that are really targeted are the groups like Salafism, Hizbut Tahrir, even Jamaat Tabligh to some extent. But those are the groups, again, seen as being this alien presence in Indonesia that the state must counteract. And so people who've done these programs have told me they came out with this really fervent belief that these groups are a real problem for Indonesia. So although there's this history, you know, the Laskar Jihad in particular, you know, lots of stories about them being funded by military, the police, particularly the military. But I think in more recent times, we find intelligence services really being quite antipathetic towards Salafism and other transnational groups.
Just perhaps to kind of add on to that as well, like an interesting dynamic that we saw around the Ahok protests in 2017 was the distinction between the military and the police. The police were very much seen as being anti kind of the 212 or the kind of like the anti kind of conservative movements, whereas the military were always portrayed, whether it's correct or not, as being kind of like defenders of the kind of people, and that included defending the right to protest and the individuals to be on the kind of street at the time. It was a very kind of interesting dynamic at the time, and this had a lot to do with Gatot Nurmanto being in charge of the military at the time.
Absolutely.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm going to go back to, this is a different kind of outreach, not international, but Sydney asks whether there's any outreach to the urban and rural poor, because the profile usually of the Salafists in Indonesia is middle to upper class as a movement. And I would just like to throw in, if you would like to talk about in the current situation, what is going on with women in the Salafi movement. We haven't discussed that at all. In your book, you talk about how it's kind of new order-ish views of women, Ibuism and the like. And I'm wondering if you still think that's the major theme. So these are two outreach questions to the poor and to women.
Sure. So no, great questions. In terms of outreach to the poor, yes, this is a major part of a lot of Salafi foundations kind of charity outreach. It can be local, it can be national. So, for example, if we're talking about in Yogyakarta, Salafis were incredibly involved back in 2010 with the Merapi kind of eruption. And helping the kind of families that suffered relocate. They also did the same thing in 2006 with the kind of earthquake in Jogja. They helped to reestablish mosques, helped to relocate individuals. And this is where their funds kind of really assist them, because they can be incredibly resourceful when they want to. And they can tap into this. It's quite a wide variety of admittedly very skilled kind of students that are eager to help. Interestingly, when they do these programs, you kind of notice that there is a bit of ambiguity from locals about exactly how involved Salafis can get. I've spoke to several individuals that owned one mosque and refused any help, despite it being cracked and broken from Salafis, because they were afraid that taking this money meant that they would have to change the dynamics of the mosque. At the same time, they're usually there to stay, so they do set up schools. So in light of the Merapi eruption, they opened the Merapi Islamic Center as a place to kind of give young kind of children kind of classes in the Quranic studies. I mean, kind of outreach programs as well to the community. And that actually kind of talks to another aspect that you see across the urban-rural poor divide. And that's the use of young Salafis to teach young kids in Quranic classes. For them, it's a great way of getting students familiar with certain verses within the Quran, their ability to kind of teach and propagate, but it's a way of endearing them to local kind of communities too. I mean, you can teach kids kind of in the evening, you can talk to their parents, you can show yourself as a model Indonesian Muslim that went to university or is going to university, and they're very apt at kind of doing this. In fact, when we're talking about, say, Wad Haslamiyah, I mean, they have a whole board and an administration that is very impressively able to coordinate this across a network of mosques in urban poor areas that we saw. So it's a very key part of how the movement kind of operates and tries to kind of reach out. An interesting part of that as well, if I'll be very brief on this, but within this as well, there is this kind of ideological dynamic. I mean, they approach these individuals as the urban poor, as non-middle class individuals. So there's a difference in the message. There's a difference of where they see themselves in the kind of perhaps the social hierarchy of Indonesia, which is an interesting aspect of it and one that's somewhat resented sometimes. In terms of women, it would be interesting. So this is an area where, as kind of a male researcher, it's very difficult to kind of make too many inroads. But I have spoken to other researchers that have kind of repeated and worked with similar groups since I was out there, that have kind of seen kind of a growing kind of sophistication of this kind of this Kawanita and this kind of idea of women kind of growing. And again, like the male section where you see the use of kind of Indonesian flags and motifs, there is a greater emphasis on this kind of aspect. An interesting kind of side note, perhaps, if we're talking about the greater political role with Muslim minoritarianism, is the there was a bit of kind of this kind of grumblings amongst women that, well, the men are now off doing politics, they're not doing the religious stuff, and they've kind of left it all to us. At the time, I don't know whether that feeling is still there, but it was kind of expressed at the time. But yeah.
Greg, do you
Oh,
have?
that's fine. Yeah, nothing to add to Chris's answer. Yeah.
So we have, unfortunately, we're approaching the end, but I'm going to ask this one last question from an anonymous attendee. And before I do that, I want to thank you both very, very much. I wish we had more time. And I want to urge everyone to go out and buy Chris's book. And I want you to go back and then come back to your Southeast Asian network and tell us what's the latest. Notes from the field. But this last question is, thank you very much for a great conversation to both Greg Fealy and Chris Chaplin. I would like to ask, can you tell us something about whether there are substantial societal, political, cultural initiatives against the conservative turn in general and the Salafi movement in particular?
Oof, that's a great question. I mean, the answer to the question might have to start with Anu. I'm not too sure what you think, Greg.
Yeah, no, it is. Well, there is one part of the answer is a little easier to give, and that is that, as we've mentioned, the Ministry of Religious Affairs has this big program called Religious Moderation that it's rolling out, and there's a lot of documents and PowerPoints and quite a hefty book about this, and I think it's going to be formally launched by Jokowi sometime soon. But so the state is aware that it may create a vacuum if all it is doing is pushing to the margins the Islamists and not putting some alternative or not reasserting these moderate values, putting that back in the space that's left. But there are reasons why I personally have a lot of reservations about this religious moderation program, purely because it's seeking to shepherd everyone into the centre, and it seeks to delegitimise what it calls left and right-wing views, and actually uses the word extreme. And there are lots of things. You could get some of the more liberal thinking within Islam, which is classified as left. That could be things to do with Islamic feminism or Islamic literature on gay, transgender rights. That could be regarded as too left, extreme. And on the right-hand side, you could get groups like Salafi groups, Hizbut Tahrir, any group like that. And they've got these very broad terms such as radical, fundamentalist, or puritanist is one of the words they have. How exactly are these terms being defined? And the final thing I'd say is we've seen in the last few weeks how these moderation campaigns can be abused by the state. And the clearest example is the Anti-Corruption Commission, where they had this national awareness test that was clearly used to weed out the most effective investigators in the KTK, in the Anti-Corruption Commission, some of whom were accused of being Taliban, of being Salafi kind of figures. And I know in some of those cases that's completely false, but nonetheless the mud stuck. And these moderation campaigns became a way of forcing these people out of the public service. So they can be weaponized, and I think we need to be very careful of that. And I mean, NU also has programs to promote moderate Islam, but there's also a risk that NU will become too zealous in this kind of work, and it will vilify groups who have legitimate peaceful beliefs that are different to their own.
Chris, the last word goes to you, but we're a little over time. And thank you again.
I mean, that was a fantastic answer. I don't really have too much to add on this one as well. An interesting kind of aspect as well of whether it can succeed or not is the fact that a lot of the kind of social dynamics of Salafism and this conservative aspect, when we're talking about kind of religious minorities or any type of minority in Indonesia, is that these things have now entered kind of the normal political lexicon. So pushing a bit back against that is incredibly difficult at the moment.
And I'd just add, Margaret, that the record of states trying to engineer religious preferences and beliefs is actually a pretty dismal one. It's a really hard thing to do. And if you're not careful, it can be counterproductive, that you may, in fact, end up strengthening the very groups that you're trying to undercut. So.
With that, much more to discuss, but we're going to have to say goodbye and thank you.